By 1944, the Pacific War had become a graveyard of Japanese dreams. The empire that once stretched from Manchuria to the Solomon Islands was collapsing, inch by inch, under the relentless pressure of American industry, technology, and firepower. Yet, even as entire fleets were annihilated and cities burned, a deep cultural current continued to flow through the Japanese army, the spirit of Bushido, the ancient code of the samurai. It was this spirit that produced some of the most extraordinary and at times tragic acts of defiance in modern warfare. Among them, few stories capture the clash between tradition and modernity as vividly as the tale of the officer who charged a tank with a sword. The story begins on the island of Saipan, a strategic outpost in the Mariana Chain, captured by Japan in 1914 and transformed into a fortress during the 1930s. By mid-1944, the Americans considered it the key to bombing Japan itself. From Saipan's runways, the new B-29 superfortresses could reach Tokyo. The Japanese, understanding its importance, were prepared to die defending it. The garrison consisted of around 30,000 soldiers and 20,000 civilians, soldiers hardened by years of training in the Imperial Army, and civilians convinced that surrender to Americans meant certain death. When U.S. Marines landed on June 15, 1944, they were met by a wall of machine gun fire and artillery. The beaches at Kanoa were littered with bodies within minutes. But the Americans pressed forward with overwhelming force, Sherman tanks, naval gunfire, and airstrikes. The Japanese, entrenched in caves and bunkers, fought fanatically, often to the last man. As the battle dragged on, one particular officer, Captain Tetsuzo Tokei, became the embodiment of Japan's fading samurai ideal. Tokei had been a career officer, educated in the old imperial academies where swordsmanship was still part of the curriculum. Though trained in modern tactics, he believed the soul of Japan's soldier lay in his courage and willingness to die for the emperor. He carried with him an ancestral katana, not a parade sword, but a family heirloom forged in the late Edo period, its blade folded and polished for generations. For him, the sword was more than a weapon. It was a connection to centuries of warriors who had lived and died by honor alone. By late June, Saipan was in ruins. The Japanese command structure had collapsed. Ammunition was running out. Tanks had been destroyed or immobilized by naval bombardment. Yet Tokei refused to accept defeat. On July 6th, the last surviving elements of the Imperial Army gathered near Mount Tapochau for what would become one of the largest banzai charges of the entire Pacific War. More than 3,000 men, many armed only with rifles, bayonets, or even bamboo spears, prepared to hurl themselves against entrenched American lines. The Americans, exhausted but cautious, had established defensive positions with tanks and machine guns. Among them was a platoon of Sherman tanks supporting the 105th Infantry Regiment. They had no idea that within hours hundreds of desperate Japanese soldiers would come screaming out of the night. At dawn, the hills exploded with sound. Thousands of voices cried, "Tenno Heika Banzai! Long live the Emperor!" Men charged forward through smoke and fire, their faces painted, their uniforms tattered. Some carried grenades, others medical stretchers turned into makeshift spears. It was chaos, primal and terrifying. Captain Tokei led one of the spearhead groups. His sword gleamed in the rising sun, a flash of silver against the blackened earth. He shouted for his men to follow, waving the katana above his head as bullets tore through the air. A few dozen soldiers followed him, not out of hope, but out of shared fatalism. They knew this was the end. The Americans opened fire immediately. Machine guns cut down waves of attackers, and mortar rounds exploded in the ravines. Yet Tokei's small group managed to reach the outer line of U.S. armor. A Sherman, hull down behind a ridge, was laying down suppressing fire with its .50 caliber machine gun. Tokei sprinted toward it, his sword raised, ignoring the gunfire snapping past him. Accounts differ on exactly what happened next, and historians still debate the details, but several American soldiers later recalled the same incredible image: a Japanese officer leaping onto the front of a Sherman, bringing his sword down on the periscope. The blow cracked the glass and slightly bent the metal rim. The gunner inside flinched as light shattered across his vision. A split second later, the tank's bow gunner fired, and the officer's body tumbled off into the dirt. The sword, still gripped in his hands, lay half buried in the mud, its blade chipped but intact. After the battle, American soldiers found it and, according to some reports, sent it back as a war trophy. But for many who saw it, the moment left a deep impression. One sergeant later wrote, "He came at us with nothing but a sword. I couldn't believe it. In that second, it felt like we were fighting another century." That image, a man with a katana against a tank, became a symbol of something larger than the battle itself. It encapsulated the paradox of Japan's war effort, a modern industrial nation still bound by the myths of its feudal past. The same ideology that inspired fanatical courage also blinded its leaders to the realities of mechanized warfare. Tokei's final charge was not unique. Similar incidents were recorded on Guam, Peleliu, and later on Okinawa, where officers sometimes led suicidal assaults armed only with swords or pistols. To the Japanese, these acts were expressions of gyokusai, the concept of honorable death as shattered jade, preferable to living as a broken tile. To the Americans, they seemed like madness. After Saipan fell, Japan's military command realized the full scale of the disaster. The loss meant the Mariana Islands could now serve as launch points for bombing Japan itself. Tokyo was within reach of the B-29s. Yet instead of reconsidering their strategy, Japanese leaders doubled down on spiritual warfare. They encouraged every soldier, every civilian, to embody the same self-sacrificial resolve that had driven men like Tokei. In propaganda films, the image of the samurai and his sword was glorified as the ultimate symbol of loyalty. Even as tanks and airplanes defined the battlefield, official rhetoric insisted that the spirit overcomes the machine. It was this belief that would later give rise to the kamikaze, another manifestation of the same desperate equation of sacrifice with victory. The sword, once the mark of noble discipline, had become an emblem of national suicide. Still, to understand men like Tokei, one must go beyond judgment. He was not delusional, at least not in the way history often paints him. To him, and to thousands like him, the sword represented a moral code older than the nation itself. The tank was just another test of that faith. In his final act, Tokei embodied the collision between Japan's spiritual heritage and the brutal logic of industrial war. The story of that charge, one man's futile strike against steel and fire, continues to haunt historians not because it changed the outcome of the war, but because it revealed what the war had already destroyed, the illusion that honor alone could defy technology. When the guns on Saipan finally fell silent in mid-July 1944, the island resembled a scorched moonscape. Smoke drifted over ravines filled with twisted metal, broken helmets, and bodies. The battle had cost Japan nearly its entire garrison, more than 29,000 dead. Only a few hundred soldiers were captured alive. Yet, even amid this devastation, stories began to circulate among American troops about the man who had attacked a tank with a sword. For the Marines and soldiers who witnessed it, the episode became a dark legend, part awe, part disbelief. It was passed along the front lines and later retold in letters home. Some described it as insanity, others as courage beyond comprehension. But for historians, the act stood as an echo of something deeper, the last flicker of a mindset born long before the age of steel armor and automatic weapons. To understand why an educated officer in 1944 would charge a Sherman with a katana, one must trace the evolution of Japan's warrior ethos. The Bushido that guided men like Captain Tokei was not a single ancient code, but a complex fusion of samurai ethics, imperial ideology, and modern nationalism. The original samurai, who had served feudal lords during Japan's medieval era, fought under a strict hierarchy of loyalty and personal honor. Death in battle was not only accepted, but often embraced as the ultimate form of devotion. By the late 19th century, when Japan transformed into a modern nation-state, this spirit was repurposed for a new age. The Meiji government, eager to unify the country under the emperor, reinvented Bushido as a moral backbone for its conscript army. The sword, once a symbol of aristocratic privilege, became the spiritual core of military training. Textbooks quoted ancient sayings about self-sacrifice, obedience, and the purity of dying in service to the emperor. Schools taught boys to admire samurai valor and despise weakness. This cultural conditioning reached its peak during the 1930s and 1940s. Every soldier in the Imperial Army carried a sword, at least ceremonially. Officers were encouraged to see themselves as heirs of the samurai. The government mass-produced shingunto swords, modern blades forged in factories but styled after traditional katanas. The true ancestral swords, like Tokei's, were rarer, often family heirlooms passed down through generations. Many officers believed their spirits would live on through these blades. When the war turned against Japan, this ideology grew even more extreme. Facing shortages of fuel, food, and ammunition, the leadership turned increasingly to spiritual power as compensation for material inferiority. Propaganda posters proclaimed that the spirit of the Japanese soldier is stronger than steel. Children learned that one man's courage could destroy a tank or an airplane. The idea that the soul conquers the machine became national dogma. On Saipan, such beliefs met the brutal arithmetic of modern warfare. The American landing forces brought with them not only overwhelming firepower, but also an entirely different philosophy of combat, one that valued technology, logistics, and survival over personal heroics. The result was a collision not just of armies, but of centuries. In the weeks after the battle, American intelligence officers scoured the island for documents and diaries. Among the recovered items were letters from Japanese soldiers expressing shame at being unable to die in combat. One note, written by a young lieutenant, read, "Our bullets are gone, our tanks destroyed, yet we must continue. To die with the sword is the only path left." This mentality was so ingrained that when cornered, entire units would launch suicidal attacks rather than surrender. Even civilians were swept up in the ideology. On Saipan's cliffs, hundreds of women and children leapt to their deaths rather than be captured, convinced by propaganda that Americans would torture them. For U.S. troops, witnessing this mass death was horrifying and confusing. They had never encountered an enemy so unwilling to live. Captain Tokei's final act thus became more than just a desperate charge. It was a tragic symbol of how deeply Japan's military had fused ancient honor with modern despair. His strike against the tank did no real damage to the enemy, but it encapsulated the Empire's last illusion that courage alone could defeat firepower. Yet even as the Japanese command promoted tales of samurai valor, within their own ranks, some officers recognized the futility. General Yoshitsugu Saito, the commander on Saipan, issued his final order before committing suicide. "Do not live in shame as prisoners. Die as soldiers, all of you." When he fell, surrounded by his staff, it marked not only the end of his army, but the symbolic death of Japan's samurai myth in modern warfare. In Tokyo, however, the story of Saipan was filtered through the lens of propaganda. Newspapers described heroic last stands, officers fighting tanks with swords, men dying with smiles on their faces. The reality, starvation, panic, and slaughter, was buried beneath slogans of unyielding loyalty. This distorted narrative would soon pave the way for the kamikaze program. The spiritual lineage was direct. If a man with a sword could strike a tank, then surely a pilot could strike a ship. The same faith that drove Tokei into machine gun fire now sent young airmen to crash their planes into steel hulls. The transformation from samurai to suicide bomber was complete. After Saipan, similar charges occurred on Guam, Leyte, and Okinawa. American troops began to dread nighttime attacks, when small groups of Japanese soldiers would crawl toward their lines, bayonets fixed, screaming battle cries. Even when surrounded, some officers carried out mock sword duels before shooting themselves. Others broke their blades rather than allow capture. One American war correspondent later wrote, "It was as if they were trying to rewrite history, to prove that the age of the sword had not truly ended." Meanwhile, historians back home began to collect artifacts from the Pacific: rifles, flags, helmets, and occasionally swords. Among them was a katana recovered on Saipan, damaged near the hilt, but still sharp. Some claimed it was Captain Tokei's. The provenance was uncertain, but the blade came to symbolize the futility of spiritual resistance in the face of industrial power. It was later displayed at a small regimental museum, where veterans would tell visitors, "This sword hit a tank once." As the Pacific Campaign continued, the American public grew fascinated with such stories. Newspapers published photographs of Japanese swords alongside articles describing fanatical soldiers who preferred death to surrender. Yet behind the fascination lay a growing recognition that Japan's entire war culture had been built on a fatal misunderstanding, a belief that courage and faith could compensate for steel and science. By the end of 1944, the myth of the invincible warrior was shattered. The empire's cities were burning, and the once proud fleet lay at the bottom of the ocean. But in countless dugouts, caves, and jungle clearings, officers still clutched their swords, waiting for the chance to make one final charge. In that sense, Captain Tokei's death on Saipan was not an isolated event. It was a rehearsal for the nation's own suicide. When Japan lost Saipan, it lost more than an island. The defeat tore open the empire's last illusion of invulnerability. For the first time, American bombers could reach the Japanese mainland. For the Imperial Army, the realization was devastating, not only strategically, but spiritually. The ancient promise of Bushido that courage and sacrifice could compensate for material weakness was collapsing under the weight of firepower and steel. In Tokyo, military leaders debated how to maintain morale as the tide of war turned. The answer, as always, was found in myth. Newspapers and radio broadcasts romanticized Saipan's last stand, portraying fallen officers as reincarnations of samurai heroes. They described bayonet charges, sword duels, and officers who met tanks with blades of honor. The public was told that these men had fought not for victory, but for virtue. In the imperial imagination, even failure could be noble, so long as it was embraced with absolute loyalty. This spiritual narrative gave birth to the empire's final weapon, the human body itself. From the ruins of Saipan emerged the doctrine that would define Japan's last year of war: organized self-destruction. The kamikaze pilots, the Gyokusai suicide attacks on Okinawa, and the Banzai charges that annihilated entire battalions, all were children of the same idea that had sent Captain Tokei against a tank. By late 1944, swords were more symbolic than practical, but they still held immense psychological power. Officers carried them not for combat efficiency, but as emblems of rank, honor, and spiritual authority. A sword drawn in battle signified a commitment to die. The act itself carried weight far beyond its military impact. Even when bullets and grenades replaced blades, the mentality remained. If defeat was inevitable, then death must be made meaningful. On the island of Peleliu, one Marine sergeant wrote in his diary about finding a Japanese officer who had charged his squad with a sword long after his men were gone. "He came at us through the smoke, swinging that damn thing like he was fighting ghosts," the sergeant wrote. "He didn't make it 5 steps, but for a second you could see it, that look, like he already knew he was dead and didn't care." Scenes like that were repeated across the Pacific. In New Guinea's jungles, on the volcanic cliffs of Iwo Jima, and in the shattered villages of the Philippines, American soldiers encountered officers clutching swords in their final moments. Sometimes they used them to commit seppuku, slicing open their abdomens before pulling the trigger. Others simply held the hilt as they bled out, believing their spirit would pass into the blade. As the empire retreated, thousands of swords were left behind, in caves, on beaches, in wrecked bunkers. Many were collected by Allied troops as war trophies. Some were mass-produced shingunto, stamped with serial numbers and manufactured steel. Others, however, were ancient heirlooms, family blades forged centuries earlier by renowned swordsmiths. In the aftermath of battle, U.S. soldiers rarely understood the spiritual weight these weapons carried. To them, a sword was a souvenir, a proof of survival or a token of victory. But for the Japanese families who had sent their sons to war, the sword was sacred. It represented lineage, soul, and duty. Losing it was like losing the man himself. In the summer of 1945, as Japan faced annihilation, this symbolism reached its tragic peak. On Okinawa, some officers went into battle carrying ancestral swords worth more than their own lives. Others, realizing the end was near, ordered subordinates to destroy their family blades so they would not fall into enemy hands. In several cases, soldiers buried them in the soil beside their comrades' graves. One diary, found in a cave on Okinawa, contained a single line: "When this blade sleeps, I sleep with it." The writer was never identified. After Japan's surrender, the Allies began a massive disarmament campaign. Millions of rifles, bayonets, and swords were confiscated. For the first time in centuries, the Japanese military, once defined by the sword, was ordered to lay down its blades. The American occupation authorities, viewing the sword as a symbol of militarism, banned its manufacture and public display. Only later, under cultural pressure, were exceptions made for historical artifacts and craftsmen. Thousands of captured swords were shipped back to the United States. Some were presented to generals as tokens of surrender, others distributed among soldiers or auctioned off. A few found their way to museums. Among them, one katana bearing a faint inscription near the tang drew attention: "To strike the iron beast." Its origin was unknown, but the words matched the story told by veterans who had witnessed Captain Tokei's final charge. Whether the blade was truly his or another officer's remains uncertain. Yet its presence, displayed behind glass decades later, evoked an eerie stillness. the intersection of faith and futility. Visitors would gaze at the elegant curvature of the steel, read the caption, and struggle to reconcile the beauty of the weapon with the madness of its use. Historians who studied these events often debated the mindset behind such suicidal courage. Was it indoctrination, fanaticism, or something older, a centuries-old notion of duty that had survived into a world where it no longer belonged? The answer, perhaps, lay somewhere in between. For Japanese officers like Tokei, death was not simply an end, but a performance, a ritual act, reaffirming identity. To fall without fear, to face the impossible, was the ultimate expression of Bushido. But in the mechanized slaughter of the 20th century, that code had become tragically obsolete. A katana, no matter how sharp, could not pierce armor. A warrior's heart could not stop a machine gun. Yet in defeat, Japan's soldiers achieved something they never intended. They forced the world to confront the limits of honor in modern war. The image of a man charging a tank with a sword would endure long after the empire that birthed it was gone. When General MacArthur accepted Japan's surrender aboard the USS Missouri, the last samurai tradition quietly died with the ceremony. Officers laid down their swords one by one, placing them before Allied representatives. Some did so with trembling hands, others with stoic calm. It was a gesture that symbolized more than submission. It marked the end of an era stretching back 7 centuries. Yet even in surrender, there was a strange dignity. The blades, some centuries old, gleamed under the gray light of Tokyo Bay. They were no longer weapons, but relics, reminders of what Japan had been and what it had lost. In the years that followed, the sword was reborn in a new form. No longer a tool of war, it became a vessel of memory. Swordsmiths who once forged weapons for battle began crafting blades for art and ceremony. The U.S. occupation eventually allowed limited restoration of the craft, recognizing it as part of Japan's cultural heritage. By the 1960s, collectors and historians in both Japan and America began tracing the origins of war swords, returning some heirlooms to families. Among them, a few katanas believed to have been used in the Pacific resurfaced in Shinto shrines, where they were re-sanctified as kami, divine spirits. For the descendants of officers like Tokei, the sword no longer symbolized conquest or revenge. It became a memorial, a connection to ancestors who had lived and died under the weight of impossible ideals. In museums, visitors still pause before these relics, reading the small brass plaques that tell impossible stories. This sword was carried during the Battle of Saipan, recovered near a destroyed Sherman tank. They look at the slender blade, perfectly balanced, its edge reflecting the light, and they imagine, for just a moment, what kind of world could drive a man to lift it against steel and fire. In the ashes of defeat, Japan's identity fractured. The empire that had once glorified death now faced the unimaginable task of learning to live. When the war ended in August 1945, millions of soldiers returned home to a country they no longer recognized. Cities lay in ruins, families were broken, and the emperor, once considered divine, had spoken to the nation with a human voice, announcing surrender. For those who had fought under the banner of Bushido, the humiliation was unbearable. Entire generations had been raised to believe that to die for the emperor was the highest honor. Yet now, survival itself became the new duty. The occupation authorities, led by General MacArthur, dismantled Japan's military institutions, banned martial propaganda, and rewrote the nation's constitution. The warrior state was over. But the spirit that had driven men like Captain Tokei could not be erased overnight. It lingered in silence, in veterans' clubs, in family altars, in the memory of those who had watched their comrades die with swords in their hands. Many former officers found themselves adrift, unable to reconcile their past heroism with the new pacifist Japan. Some opened small dojos, teaching kendo or aikido not as training for war, but as exercises in discipline and remembrance. Others never spoke of the war again. In post-war Japan, the sword underwent a quiet transformation. Once a weapon of death, it became a symbol of artistry, craftsmanship, and spiritual refinement. Swordsmiths who had been banned from working during the occupation were gradually allowed to resume their craft, but under strict regulations. They forged blades not for generals, but for preservation, to keep alive a skill that had defined Japanese culture for over 1,000 years. One such craftsman, Gasan Sadakazu, whose family lineage dated back to the Edo period, told an American journalist in 1952, "The sword must never again kill. It must remember." His words captured the shift in Japan's national consciousness. The katana, once the embodiment of conquest, became a vessel for collective mourning. At the same time, popular culture began reshaping the image of the samurai. In the 1950s and 60s, filmmakers like Akira Kurosawa brought the old warrior ethos to the screen, not as propaganda, but as tragedy. In Seven Samurai and Harakiri, the blade was no longer a tool of empire, but a mirror reflecting human frailty, pride, and sacrifice. Through these films, the samurai spirit was reborn, not as a call to arms, but as an art of reflection. To Western audiences, this reimagined samurai became an object of fascination. American veterans who had fought in the Pacific began collecting swords not as trophies, but as symbols of respect. Museums in the United States curated exhibitions on Japanese craftsmanship, often juxtaposing the elegance of the sword with the brutality of war. One display in the Smithsonian featured a katana believed to have been carried during the Battle of Saipan, alongside photographs of wrecked Sherman tanks. The caption read, "From the Age of Steel to the Age of Spirit." Meanwhile, in Japan, the children of fallen soldiers grew up in peace, but not in forgetfulness. Many families maintained small shrines to the dead, where a sword or a uniform fragment stood in place of a body never recovered. These memorials blurred the line between religion and remembrance. They did not glorify war, but sought to give meaning to sacrifice. Among these relics, one story endured, the tale of a captain who had struck a tank with his sword. Over time, the man's name faded into legend. Some called him Tokei, others Tokuda, or even the Samurai of Saipan. His exact identity became less important than what he represented, the last collision between Japan's feudal soul and the machinery of modernity. In the 1970s, a Japanese historian, Dr. Hiroshi Tanabe, began researching first-hand accounts of the Saipan battle. He interviewed surviving American veterans, pored over unit reports, and compared testimonies from both sides. His conclusion was cautious but profound. The charge may have been real, or it may have been embellished. But its truth lies not in fact, but in meaning. It captures the essence of a generation that believed honor could challenge destiny. That sentence would later appear in Tanabe's acclaimed book, Steel and Spirit, The Death of the Samurai in the Pacific War, which helped redefine how post-war Japan viewed its military past. The samurai was no longer seen as a hero or a villain, but as a symbol of humanity's eternal struggle between courage and futility. In modern Japan, where neon lights replace torchlight and high-speed trains cut through mountains once crossed by warriors, the katana remains a quiet reminder, not of conquest, but of conscience. Swordsmanship is now practiced as meditation, a dialogue between the self and the blade, a test of patience rather than strength. The same curve that once caught the morning sun over Saipan now gleams under fluorescent lights in peaceful dojos. Every few years, veterans' associations still gather at memorials for the Pacific battles. They come not in uniform, but in plain clothes, gray-haired and slow-moving. Some carry small photographs of comrades long gone. At one such ceremony in Kagoshima, an elderly man, a former junior officer, was asked about the story of the sword that struck a tank. He smiled faintly and said, "It wasn't madness, it was the end of something." For him, and for many others, that act represented the closing chapter of a 1,000-year-old story, a story in which the warrior's courage, stripped of purpose, met the unstoppable logic of machines. The moment the sword struck steel, Japan's past collided with its future. And yet, the legacy of that collision did not vanish. It transformed. The very ideals that once led men to die, loyalty, endurance, self-discipline, were reborn in new forms: craftsmanship, education, and relentless work ethic. The Bushido that had fueled destruction was sublimated into creation. Post-war Japan rebuilt itself with the same intensity once reserved for war, channeling the spirit of sacrifice into progress. In that sense, the samurai did not truly die on Saipan. He evolved. His sword no longer drew blood, but carved precision steel. His discipline no longer conquered lands, but built industries. The warrior's silence became the engineer's focus, the artisan's patience, the craftsman's pride. Today, the story of Captain Tokei, or whoever he truly was, endures as both caution and reflection. His charge reminds us of the cost of faith untempered by reason, and the nobility that can exist even within tragedy. At the Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, where the souls of Japan's war dead are enshrined, a small display case holds several swords recovered from Pacific battlefields. Visitors walk past them quietly. Some bow, some do not. Each blade gleams faintly under soft light, untouched for decades. A plaque beside them reads, "May the spirit of the sword never again rise in war, but remain as a memory of those who believed." It is a fitting epitaph for Captain Tokei and the countless others who followed the same impossible creed, men who carried the weight of centuries into a world that had already moved beyond them. And so the story ends where it began, with a man standing before a tank, a sword in his hands, and the entire history of his people reflected in its steel. The blade rises once more, not in defiance, but in remembrance, a glint of light against armor, a final gesture of honor in a war that left none.